Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 4 on the peoples of Middle-earth. And tonight we will see what feels to me like the actual beginning of the Appendices, which is really fun. I have to admit that I have been finding the history of the Appendices. Okay, I was just about to say I've been finding it much more exciting than that sounds, but I realize that's a low bar, right? Like the draft history of the Appendices doesn't actually sound very exciting, but it is really exciting. It has, the thing that has been so much fun about studying this carefully and going through this with you guys is that it helps. It has been filling in the gaps in a really fascinating way between the writing of the Lord of the Rings. I'm learning more in this first section of the peoples of Middle-earth, and just really going through this and studying it together. I've learned more in this process about the relationship between the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings than I think I had I'd ever really had before. What I mean by that is that it's, I think that we Tolkien fans tend to think about that relationship in sort of one of two fairly simple kind of binaries, right? On the one hand, we remember that in 1954, when The Lord of the Rings started coming out, the Silmarillion hadn't been published and wouldn't be published for decades, right? And of course, there may be people attending this evening who remember the days when The Lord of the Rings had been published and the Silmarillion had not. And so that's one kind of state in which we settle in, right? That thinking about the Lord of the Rings in the absence of the Silmarillion, right? That's kind of one way in which we've sort of disciplined ourselves to kind of remember that was the case, right? And so let us school ourselves to not always be thinking of the Silmarillion. But then, of course, but we know, obviously, that Tolkien did have it, the Silmarillion, right? Like, we know that these stories were there and that many of this stuff was in his mind. And we've seen already, here and many times before in earlier volumes of the history of Middle-earth, very much evidence of how much it was on Tolkien's mind, how much the completion of the Silmarillion put the completion of the Lord of the Rings put the Silmarillion more in Tolkien's mind, and his desire to publish it increased. And in fact, I believe that we were recently reviewing how Tolkien's desire to publish the Silmarillion alongside the Lord of the Rings was so strong that he jeopardized the success of getting the Lord of the Rings published at all in order to try to achieve it, in his flirtation with Milton Waldman and HarperCollins. Leaving, in fact, Allen and Unwin in the lurch. Okay, that's a little unfair, but basically breaking off with them. Anyway, all of this is to say, we know that the Silmarillion was very much in Tolkien's mind and on his mind and in his heart through the writing of the Lord of the Rings, and then in a sense even especially after he finished writing the Lord of the Rings. So again, state number 1 is we'll try to be like, okay, remember, try to forget the Silmarillion exists and just read the Lord of the Rings, because that's, how the text would, that's, Tolkien knew that was the audience to whom Tolkien knew he was presenting the Lord of the Rings. And so it's really interesting and I think really important always to remember that and to perform that exercise of trying to forget what you know about the Silmarillion when you read the Lord of the Rings. At the same time, we then will remember and how important it was and all that stuff I was just saying. And so we'll kind of put it back, right? But when we do, we tend almost always to put the published Silmarillion back, right? The published Silmarillion that we know. And that all of us who have been reading Tolkien since 1977, have been reading and have been studying, right? And so when we think about that simple thing, the Lord of the Rings without the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings with the Silmarillion, the thing that I've been coming to realize more and more that this studying this through with you guys has really been bringing home to me, is that it's really easy to get into a really sloppy idea about that. That if we are taking the published Silmarillion, the 1977 Silmarillion, and we're projecting that back into the time of the writing of The Lord of the Rings and the time immediately post-publication, like this time, 1948 to 1954, if we're projecting the 1977 Christopher edited Silmarillion back into that time, that's a figment. That's a fairy tale. That's not true. That's not, in fact, what was happening. That's not what the Silmarillion was. And Jackie, it is really hard, as you say. It is so hard not to do that, because that to us, us post 1977 people, and I did read the Lord of the Rings for many years without knowing the Silmarillion even existed, just because I was a child living in the woods in West Virginia with no access to a library, but I had been given a copy of the Lord of the Rings, so I had that. Anyway, but I've never lived really in the pre-Silmarillion world. But anyway, it is not simply the case. It is not at all the case that what we think of as the Silmarillion, the 1977 Silmarillion, that is not what was the thing that was in Tolkien's heart and on his mind in 1948 to 1950. And so when he is writing, so the role that the appendices play in the history of the Silmarillion is something that I've never really thought enough about. But you can begin to see it in these early chapters we've been reading. You can begin to see how when he finishes writing the Lord of the Rings, that writing, the story of the Lord of the Rings and all of its rich connections to the stories of the Elder Days that he'd already written and already had in mind, and the stories of the Elder Days that it inspired, like the Numenor story, right, and all that stuff. That he took a break from the Lord of the Rings in order to write. All those things have been going on sort of in the background, forcing their way into the foreground, right, at various points throughout the Lord of the Rings. So when he finishes, when Tolkien gets to, well, I'm back for the multiple time, right, as he's going through and revising and stuff, when he gets to, well, I'm back and finishes the Lord of the Rings, now what? Well, now it's time to return to that matter. But he doesn't just jump to rewriting the Grey Annals, right? To doing the Grey Annals, redoing the Annals of Valinor, doing the, rewriting the Quenta. All that stuff that we were reading in Morgoth's Ring and The War of the Jewels, volumes 10 and 11 of the history of Middle-earth. He'll get to that, to the actual rewriting of this material. But his transition to that, the way that he gets there is the appendices. The appendices are his bridge, are his gateway, right? To rediscovering, remapping that world. And it's so cool to see that in action. It's so cool to see that happen, to see how, to see the ways in which his revised ideas about the Silmarillion, those things we've already read and discussed in Morgoth's Ring and War of the Jewels, how many of those things are emerging from, how they emerge from the Lord of the Rings, the ways in which the Silmarillion, the later Silmarillion, is in some ways based upon and inspired by the Lord of the Rings. Not just motivated by, but inspired by, in fact, the Lord of the Rings. And again, this is something, we are too simplistic in the way that we think about this, right? Like we tend to think, we not only, when we put the Silmarillion back into the Lord of the Rings equation, we not only take the 77 Silmarillion and put that thing back in, but we put it before the Lord of the Rings, right? It's like we imagine in our own heads that Tolkien is sitting there in 1939, right? 1938, 39, when he's starting the Lord of the Rings, as if he already had the 1977 Silmarillion on his shelf when he did that. We tend to think of the Lord of the Rings as growing out of and being inspired by the Silmarillion material. And of course, in many senses it is. It's not that that's wholly untrue. But we tend to completely overlook the ways in which what we know as the Silmarillion grew out of the Lord of the Rings and was inspired by the Lord of the Rings. And that's, again, the more I've been thinking about that, the more exciting I have been finding this, and the more I realize this is, I think, really a weakness, right? That we're missing out on a lot of the fun. Maureen, it really is a dialogue between the two works, and I think it's a really fun way to thinking about it. Yeah, and you're right, Dora. We do tend to think too linearly about it. It's more like a web, as Fencing Frog says. It's not really a linear problem. Exactly, and yes, Eric, it's really interesting to do this now that the poetry volumes are out. Yeah. And that's a whole nother thing. But anyway, okay. So that's I'm sorry, I wasn't planning to do that preamble. It's been on my mind all day. But it is super. But this is why the project of the appendices. What does it mean to write an appendix of the to the Lord of the Rings? Why write an appendix to the Lord of the Rings? And the way you can see that as the jumping off point. Remember, how did the Quenta Silmarillion begin? What is the origin story of the Quenta Silmarillion? Well, if you remember your Shaping of Middle-earth, right, Volume 4 of the History of Middle-earth, you'll remember that it started, with the sketch of the mythology, Green Great Dragon. That's exactly right. And why did he write the sketch of the mythology? Why was he writing what he was trying to make a short, just a couple page prose synopsis of the mythology? Because he felt that he needed to provide context, Van Arrow, exactly, to the Children of Húrin epic poem that he had just lent to a colleague, right? And this was one of his colleagues who was saying, I don't really think it's too bad that alliterative meter can't really work in modern English. And Tolkien's like, well, actually. And so he gives him the Children of Húrin to read. And then he's like, this story might make more sense if I gave you some context. So he wrote the sketch of the mythology, and that grows into the Quenta Noldorin, which grows into the Quenta Silmarillion. That is to say, the whole of what we currently think of as the Silmarillion, which chiefly the Quenta Silmarillion, right? What we think of as the Silmarillion is the development and outgrowth of, I need to provide background context for a story. What's he doing in the appendices? Providing background context for his story, right? And so that's what we see in some ways, I think, what we can see in the birth and growth of the appendices of the Lord of the Rings is something like the rebirth of the Silmarillion. There are ways in which that would be an overly dramatic way to say it. Like it's he's got lots of material already and he's still using it and revising it. So it's not like he's scrapping it and starting it again completely, which would be kind of Tolkien as an approach. But he's not exactly, and so I'm not claiming that he's doing that. But you see what I mean, right? It's the same kind of occasion. He's setting out to do the same task that led to the original birth of it. And what is the result? What happens when he sits down and rewrites the Appendices? Well, what happens is it's born again. He ends up like all of like the Morgoth's ring and the War of the Jewels is what happens. Like all of that material, all of that rewriting. Because when he was trying to shop the Silmarillion to Allen and Unwin and to Milton Waldman at HarperCollins in, the late 40s, early 50s, when that stuff was going down, it's not the Morgoth's Ring, War of the Jewels materials that he had. He hadn't written that stuff yet. He was still flogging the 1937 stuff. Right? That was still the Silmarillion in his mind. He hadn't gotten there yet. How does he get there? Why is it that when his hopes of publishing the Silmarillion are killed by the rejection by Allen and Unwin, followed by the falling apart of the negotiations with Milton Waldman at HarperCollins, and then his crawling back to Allen and Unwin, contritely, and asking them if they would still be interested in publishing The Lord of the Rings, by itself. Only then, it's after that all of this new stuff begins coming around, right? He didn't do all of it in preparation for those. It wasn't part of those. I mean, it was some of it was happening at the same time. I'm not trying to make it more linear than it is, but again, it's all. What seems to me is that the energy for all of that, the energy for the 1937 revisions, came from the publication of The Hobbit, right? Came from the acceptance of The Hobbit and the impending publication of The Hobbit, and the hope that inspired that he'd be able to publish the Silmarillion stuff next. So in 1937, he was, as we saw when we were talking about the Shaping of Middle-earth and The Lost Road, especially The Lost Road, Volume 5. We saw that he was frantically revising the material because he thought his ship had come in and the time was here to publish the Silmarillion, right? But that's not what motivates the entirety of his stretch from like 1950 to 1960, 63, right? Of the main work that he was doing on revising the Silmarillion materials, the Grey Annals, the New Quenta, right? The Annals of Beleriand, and all that stuff. This, I think, is where that came from. That's what I mean by reborn, right? And reborn in exactly the same. The mechanism of delivery was the same thing. The inspiration was the same. Writing a short, it's got to be short, a short summary of the history in order to provide context for a story. Yes, I see you guys trolling the trolls in the comments, talking about how Tolkien destroyed his own lore, apparently. Yes, and JJ's insistence that the Silmarillion obviously was like completely consistent, without change, emerging whole from Tolkien's mind. Yeah, no, I get it. There are a lot of Tolkien fans and people, at least who strongly posture online as Tolkien fans, and I'm not trying to differentiate between true fans and non-true fans or anything. I just mean that some people seem to just like yelling at people online, and will take almost any occasion to do that. Is what I primarily mean. But yeah, that the idea that Tolkien's ideas are in flux in the way that they are. I mean, it is such a richly complicated and beautiful and exciting and fun. Like, it's such a wonderful puzzle. It's a real living world, Maureen. You're absolutely right. His creative world is so much better than a, once for all, like one draft, inspired thing that he dropped and left there. Anyway, but let's say we start a slide. How about that? Let's actually get to it, because even my claim that this is the beginning of the Appendices is a little bit strange in some ways. One of the reasons I say that is to kind of differentiate between what we've been looking at so far in our first 3 sessions on the peoples of Middle-earth has been the prefatory material. Even though, and he's completely right, like again, I'm not trying to challenge Christopher in his assertion that the last bit that we read, that we talked about last time, is the, seed of Appendix F. So he called it F asterisk, right? It's like the proto Appendix F. That's true in the sense that much of what Tolkien wrote there will get its primary later life, as Appendix F. So that's certainly true. If you're just trying to trace Appendix F back to its roots, I agree that that's clearly its roots. But the way in which I think that's not fair to say is that it seems perfectly clear that Tolkien intended that not as an appendix, but as a preface. It was part of a frame for the beginning, a frame in which to place it from the start, rather than context to provide after the fact. So here now, when we get the first real version of Appendix F, this is where things really begin. And it's one of those things, isn't it? When you first learn that essentially Appendix F, which is the appendix on languages, when you learn that Appendix F was the first appendix that Tolkien wrote, isn't it like one of those things where you're like, if I had been asked if I didn't guess that, I should have, you know what I mean? It's like, if you didn't see that coming, you should have seen it coming. And you sort of realize that as soon as you do. Right. But yeah, it makes all kinds of sense. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The last piece of context here, I've advanced to a slide, but I'm still not reading it because I had no idea how much prefatory material I had to say today. But apparently I still have one more thing. And that one more thing is, I want to make sure to remind everybody, because I don't want to make the assumption that everybody, who's listening to this episode has patiently sat through the last decade of classes that we've done on the rest of the history of Middle-earth. So let me just say as a very brief reminder, don't forget that Tolkien says in his preface to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, the one that was alluded to last time, the famous one that everybody knows, the one in which he says he cordially dislikes allegory and all that sort of thing, and where he talks about the ring not being the nuclear bomb and all that stuff. In that preface, he also explains that the languages that these stories were primarily linguistic in inspiration. And there have been several points in our discussion of the history of Middle-earth where we have seen that happening, where we've seen that in practice. My favorite one was when we did the Tree of Tongues, and I'm totally blanking right now as to whether that's in volume 4 or 5. Can somebody tell me? I think the Thlamis is in 5 in The Lost Road. The Thlamis, the Tree of Tongues. But that was one of the clearest places where you can see how the entire shape, how the thing genuinely begins as a linguistic exercise. And with him theorizing like cross-cultural linguistic development and influence, and proposing like every possible use case, and historical situation he could imagine. And then the stories emerge, and you can see how the stories emerged from them. If you know the Silmarillion, even the 77 Silmarillion, you can immediately see how the linguistic situation that he describes is in fact the roadmap for the stories as they're going to emerge. And it's really, really cool. And there have been other moments where we've seen similar things about how the language leads to the history stuff. I want to be thinking a lot tonight about this because that's why, of course, it's wholly unsurprising that he starts with Appendix F. But I want to be thinking carefully about that relationship between history and language tonight, because I think there's some fascinating stuff we can see happening in this first version of Appendix F. So when I say when I specify the 77 Silmarillion, Jocelyn, I am referring to the edition of the Silmarillion that Christopher Tolkien edited and published in 1977. And I am specifying that as differentiated from the Silmarillion stories that Tolkien had in his mind at different points in history, and most especially in circa 1948 through 1951, which is the time that we're talking about right here. The time right at was what the Silmarillion was, the status of those stories, the development of those stories, what was and was not in them or a part of the stories at that time. And it's quite different from the 1977 Silmarillion. So that's why I keep specifying that, Jocelyn, to be clear. In general, I follow Christopher's usage. Christopher has the advantage, which I don't because I'm in an oral medium and he was in a written medium. Christopher has the advantage of italicizing Silmarillion when he's referring to the published Silmarillion in 1977, and he just uses Silmarillion without italics and a capital S when he's referring to like the body of stories generally as it evolved over time. It's like his biggest picture thing. When he talks about the Silmarillion with a capital S and no italics, he's referring to the whole thing, basically, as it developed over time, the Silmarillion material. Anyway, so yeah, but as I say, it's harder for me to distinguish. So many of the times when as I said at the very beginning of class tonight, I've been made a little bit more sensitive while reading this to the fact that I have for far too long tended to sloppily import the full 1977 Silmarillion back into my conception of what was in Tolkien's mind when he wrote The Lord of the Rings, made those Silmarillion references, right? And we're gonna be seeing some of the ways in which that isn't true here tonight. But that's only if I actually ever go on to read a slide, which I shall now do. So here's Christopher introducing this pair of manuscripts, which he calls F1 and F2. F1 is the first draft, F2 is the second draft. It is noteworthy to me that Christopher describes F2 as a very neatly, carefully written document. That seems to suggest, generally, I mean, we know the high variation in Tolkien's handwriting, how it can go from almost perfectly illegible scrawl all the way up through calligraphy. But generally, as we've seen at many points in the history of the Silmarillion, when he is writing a fair copy in very careful and easy to read text, this is likely something that he is preparing. It shows he's preparing it for an audience. It's not just for his own benefit. These are not just his notes, but he has this in mind. And in this case, it seems clear that he's wanting this published with the Silmarillion. This is designed to be an actual first draft of an appendix, not a prologue, not a preface, not a foreword, but an actual appendix to The Lord of the Rings. Okay. Long afterwards, my father wrote that the actual common speech was sketched in structure and phonetic elements and a number of words invented. And in this work, that is what will become Appendix F eventually, he is seen developing the true forms in the Westron tongue to underlie the translated or substituted names, especially of hobbits. A great deal of this material was subsequently lost from the appendix. That is, The published Appendix F does not include anything like all of what Tolkien said, Christopher is informing us. This original version is also of great interest in documenting his conception of the languages of Middle-earth and their interrelations at the time when the narrative of The Lord of the Rings had recently been completed, and also in showing how substantially that conception was still to be developed before the publication of The Lord of the Rings in 1954 to 1955. So not only are Tolkien's ideas going to develop a lot before he has written everything that he has written, from which Christopher draws the final texts to use in the 77 Silmarillion, but even between here and 1954 to 5, when The Lord of the Rings is actually published, even then, even in that gap of time, there's going to be movement in these stories. Now notice, I've made a step there that Christopher didn't make, and I'll stand by it. Christopher here talks about documenting his conception of the languages of Middle-earth and their interrelations, and in showing how substantially that conception, that is to say, the conception of the languages of Middle-earth, was still to be developed. Christopher is referring explicitly to what Tolkien is explicitly talking about. Of course, Christopher is very responsible, right? And what Tolkien is explicitly discussing in this appendix is the development of his conception. He's demonstrating, he's talking about the languages, and in talking about the languages, he is demonstrating how his conception of the language, of those languages and their relationships, what it is at this time. And Christopher is saying, and we will see how that will change. Yes, Christopher is of course correct that is what Tolkien is talking about, and we will be able to see that his conception of the languages is going to change over time. But what I find really exciting about that, again, the connection between language and history, between language and story, and it's more than just the conception of the languages of Middle-earth and their interrelations. The conception of the languages of Middle-earth and their relations, that's the story, right? That's the narrative. That's where it came from, right? And so it's the stories themselves that we can see growing and changing. We can see where they are in 1950, and Christopher promises that we'll be able to see what they've grown to, even by 1954. To date this version precisely seems scarcely possible, but at least it can certainly be placed before the summer of 1950, and I think that it may well be earlier than that. He can date it that way primarily because of the use of particular names. He mentions in his commentary, for instance, calling the Grey Elves who stayed behind in Middle-earth, calling them the Lembi. He was still using the word Lembi in a text that he definitely did write in the summer of 1950, but very soon after that, in revising that, he changed the name from Lembi and stopped calling them that. So the fact that he uses the word Lembi with no annotation or correction to it, that's why he's saying he can't have written this after the summer of 1950, because if he had, he wouldn't have used that name. He'd already changed it by then. Anyway, so yes, at the latest by the summer of 1950, possibly, or it might have been 1949. And that means that this is emerging in about the same period of time, like in that same era, 1948 through 1950, in that time, right when he's finished writing The Lord of the Rings, and this stuff is all emerging and coming out. Okay. All right. The version that Christopher is giving us, he says it's mostly version 2. Though he has notes to show where there are major deviations. Once again, enormously grateful for the incredibly complicated work that Christopher has done, not just in editing this, but in presenting it as clearly as possible. We've been talking about what a web this stuff is, and it is. even as complicated as this chapter is, right? This is one of those, like, keep your finger in one place for the main text, and then a second place for the notes, and then a third place for the commentary on it, right? And you've got, it's tricky. But despite as complicated as it kind of looks, Christopher's still making it look easier than it is, I think, for us. But anyway, okay. Tolkien says, we have in these histories to deal with both Elvish and Mannish tongues. The long history of Elvish speech I will not treat. Except he kind of will, but not at length. But since 3 changed to 2 varieties of it are glimpsed in this book, a little may be said about it. Pause there. What? I have no authority with which to say this is what Tolkien was thinking when he wrote this, but it's an irresistible game to play when we see him make a strikeout like that. He originally writes, but since 3 varieties of the Elvish speech are glimpsed in this book, a little may be said about it. But then he crossed out 3 and changed it to 2. Now, if he had just said, but since 2 varieties of it are glimpsed in this book, a little may be said about it, we wouldn't have blinked. We're like, oh yeah, Quenya and Sindarin, sure. But he originally wrote 3. Why did he write 3? Not because, and I don't mean that in a sense of like, well, what could the third language possibly be? We know what the third language could possibly be. Remember, he talked about 3 Elvish languages in that prologue that he wrote. F*** that we talked about last time, right? That is, there was the language, the Elf Latin, there was the Noldorin, and there was the language of the elves of Middle-earth. The Noldorin language, of course, as everyone will remember without any possibility of confusion, is the language which we tend to think of as Sindarin, right? Except it's not Sindarin, it's the language of the Noldor, obviously. So what was the third then? If what we think of as Sindarin, Amon Hen and Orodruin and Gondor, are all words in Noldorin, then what's the third language? Well, the analog to it is, yes, Sylvan. Exactly. The language of the Green Elves. Like what is presumably Legolas's native tongue. It's easy to see, I think, why he crossed out 3 and said 2. Because if he says 3 varieties of it are glimpsed in this book that is in the Lord of the Rings, he might have felt he was misleading people, that was too confusing. Because there's no question that you're primarily glimpsing what we, just to use the names we're familiar with, what we will, from a later perspective, call Quenya and Sindarin. Those are the 2 primary ones that you see all over the place. But even an amateur reader can generally tell the difference between the 2 of them. I think I had a sense of that, right? Even as ignorant and uncurious about the languages as I've confessed myself to be, especially when I was a kid. Yes, Legolas is, in fact, of Sindarin extraction, but his people, right? Like the elves of Mirkwood don't speak Sindarin, they speak Sylvan. So again, you can say, well, yeah, there's not a whole lot of Sylvan. So why did he write 3 in the first place? He wrote 3, which means there must in fact be glimpses of it in this book. Where? Yeah, tenacious. That's what I was thinking too. I was thinking of Legolas calling himself. So like we of the Sylvan folk, like he he identifies as a Sylvan elf, right? Yeah, yeah. Irk, yeah, I think is really interesting. Like that's what we hear. What's his name? It's like Orofin. Right? It's not Haldir, right? It's one of Haldir's brothers, who says orc in possibly Sylvan. I also think Daro. Remember what is shouted originally when Legolas is going to climb the tree, and somebody, whether it's Haldir or somebody else, yells Daro at them. That's presumably Sylvan as well. But yeah, there can't be more than a couple words of it in the whole story. So I think that so my suspicion of what 3 crossed out 2 means, he originally wrote 3 because he's like, there's totally like, there are like at least 2 words attested or whatever. Like that counts. And then he's like, but admittedly that might be misleading, right? If I'm instructing people to look at all the Elvish words and names in the story and divide them up into thirds, they're pretty uneven thirds, right? So maybe I should just call it 2. And because remember, a couple of you were making comments about this, about Tolkien not necessarily being a very shrewd marketer, and the kind of where the line is between Tolkien's private interests and an actual assessment of what readers are going to want, and what readers need. But I think, and we've seen this already in the prefatory material that we've been looking at the drafts of so far. It is clearly Tolkien's explicit hope. I mean, he says it. He makes it explicit that it is his hope that readers of The Lord of the Rings are going to be curious, are going to want to figure out the language. And we've talked about how he has seeded not just evidences of the language, but ways to figure it out. It's one of the things that is so remarkable. When creative writers of fantasy are inspired by Tolkien, which is very understandable, or try to emulate Tolkien, which is usually a mistake. When they do this, one of the manifestations of this is often to include foreign languages, right? Untranslated foreign languages, like Tolkien does at times, or names, in another language. And some who are trying to be extremely Tolkien-like will even fully conlang it, right? They'll make a constructed language. They'll invent their own language and try to make it consistent in ways so that they can weave that into their stories. But the next stage from that, right? What Tolkien did was not just include some funny sounding alien languages. And it isn't even just that he had invented those languages much more holistically, in fact, behind the scenes. And it isn't even just that he had, in fact, also developed like this entire history of like the philology of their languages and changing over time and centuries and over their history. It's not even that. It is that what he included in The Lord of the Rings is generally, consistently, and pervasively designed to be the teaching tools. He provides Rosetta Stones all over the place. He doesn't just want to impress you or to make an impression of alienness or something upon you. He doesn't just want to make it sound cool. He wants you to learn the language. He wants you to figure it out. He wants you to see the patterns, and he embeds all of those patterns there. Yeah, he's not just philologically flexing Fëanor. He shows from the very beginning, consistently, from beginning to end, the earnest, passionate desire and hope that readers will want to figure it out, and he makes it as possible as he can for them to do it. Which, again, is why I say he would have been so disappointed in me, who ignored all of those cues for many times. But yeah, Maureen, it's funny because Maureen was saying ever the professor. You know, it's interesting though, because in some ways, of course, yes, Tolkien was passionate about languages and philology and teaching languages. I think of the early letters from his time at Leeds and how proud he was of the Leeds students and the program that they had built at Leeds, and it's, you know, holding its own with the literature stuff and everything else, right? All that stuff. Those letters are really fascinating. You can see his passion. You can see how much he really loves, you can see how much he really loves sharing that passion with people. So in that sense, absolutely, yes. I don't think in the end, I've never felt in the end that teaching is Tolkien's primary passion. I don't think he's first and foremost a teacher. He was a teacher, and he did have that impulse. And I think nowhere do we see it more clearly than this. The thing that is his, like the core passion of his life, languages and the history of languages, is where you can see his teaching impulses come out most. But he's not like an inveterate teacher. C.S. Lewis is an inveterate teacher. He can't help himself. Tolkien isn't like that. And it's one of the reasons why their whole approach and styles are so very different. It's one of the main reasons that The Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia, so similar in so many ways, conceptually, are so different and come across so differently. Anyway, okay. Yeah, well, Green Great Dragon, both of them are sub-created. My shorthand for this is simply like, at heart, C.S. Lewis they're both sub-creators. They both sub-created worlds. They were both great storytellers. But in his heart, C.S. Lewis was a teacher. In his heart, Tolkien was a poet. That's my, crudest, shortest hand version of that comparison. But it doesn't mean C.S. Lewis didn't write poetry, and it doesn't mean that Tolkien didn't teach, right? They both shared those things, both of those things, but in heart, they were, I think, different. Anyway, okay, but let's move on. I'm going tremendously slowly tonight. So back to the two varieties of Elvish that are glimpsed in this book. And Jackie, you had mentioned the quotation from issue 17 of the Parma Eldalamberon, that nothing of this Sylvan speech appears in the Lord of the Rings except Darrow and Irksh. Both of these are or could be Sindarin. Yes, and I would politely suggest, though goodness knows, Carl and the other scholars who contribute to Parma Eldalamberon have an ocean of knowledge of Tolkien's languages and linguistic history compared to my thimbleful. So I'm not trying to second guess them there. But this passage right here, I would point to as pretty strong evidence that Tolkien thought there was Sylvan in The Lord of the Rings. The fact that he wrote 3. I don't think he wrote 3 and crossed out and wrote 2 because he's like, oh yeah, actually I didn't put any in after all. No, I think it's because he was like, does 2 words really count? Probably not. I probably shouldn't say so. I think, at least at this moment in his mind, it's possible that as the languages develop in his mind later on, Darrow and Irch get subsumed into Sindarin, essentially, in his later development of it. But I think this sentence suggests that whenever he wrote this, 1949 or whatever, totally Sylvan. Or, again, the language that we now call Sylvan. Okay, according to Elvish historians, now let's get into the history of tongues. According to Elvish historians, the elven folk, by themselves called the Quendi, and elven speech were originally one. The primary division was into Eldar and Avari. The Avari were those elves who remained content with Middle-earth, struck out, and refused the summons of the powers, but they and their many secret tongues do not concern this book. I'm a little bit unclear where the strikeout ends. Do you think it's at refuse the summons of the powers? Or did he strike it out all the way to the end of the sentence? Probably to the end of the sentence, right? One of the things I think we can see there, you guys have seen this pattern before. I find Christopher's presentation of Tolkien's crossouts and additions and strikeouts are like my favorite thing about the drafts. I love them. I love them because what I love about the drafts is watching the development of Tolkien's mind. These places where when you're reading a text, you're getting, like, when Tolkien writes something, you have a data point. It's a complex data point. There are many things that are being said in any given like sentence or paragraph, right? But let's call that one data point. From that one data point, you can make many interpretations, and it's really hard to have anything to compare to, like, anchor them necessarily. You can do it, by comparing it with other passages and stuff. But as far as like to try to answer the question, what was in Tolkien's mind when he wrote that? It's hard to make a definitive case from one data point, right? But when we have his crossouts and strikeouts, we now have multiple data points, like that 3-2 thing. Look at how much more that suggests. What both of the use of those two were, the words 3 and the words 2, right? And the word 2. That unfolds itself so much by adding that second data point on top. And it shows us so much more, because now we have 2 points. You can make a line between 2 points, right? We can actually see the progress. Now, can we be sure about it? No, I mean, you really need 3 points to be able to be sure it's a line, of course, because if you have, and I'm just speaking mathematically here, right? If you've got 2 points, you can connect 2 points. There could be an arc between them. There could be a squiggle between them, right? It could be a sine wave. Who knows what it is? But you at least you've got a pretty good hint, and you've got a reason to think that there's a line, right, that connects those two. And so this is why I love strikeouts and insertions are like my favorite thing, because we get 2 data points that we can connect directly in a line. And I feel like in those moments we can get closer. No, wait, let me say it a different way. We have better evidence from which to draw conclusions about what Tolkien was thinking as he wrote than we do anywhere else. And it's so cool. It's so much fun. Okay. So, what's the line here between data point number 1, which is that whole sentence, and data point number 2, which is that sentence struck out? And I think the trajectory, I think the line there is we can see he's trying to contain himself. This is paragraph 3. This is paragraph 1 of his attempt to tell the history, right? He's just started a paragraph according to Elvish historians. Right? In other words, he's saying, here beginneth my summary of the Silmarillion, right? My summary of the history of the Elder Days. He's had a go at this before. And we know what happens when he does. it becomes the Silmarillion, right? We can see, yes, Jackie, I agree. What is it? Sentence 3. Sentence 3 is starting to get leaky. It is. It's starting to become a map with a scale of 1 to 1. It's threatening to, right? But he catches it. He catches it. The Avari were those elves who remain content with Middle-earth and refuse the summons of the powers, but they and their many secret tongues do not concern this book. The power, like, do we need to know about the Valar and their motivations and their histories and their languages? No, not if you want to keep this a concise summary of the history of Elvish tongues. No, we don't need to know that, right? And so he catches himself and strikes that. Okay, never mind. Forget about the Valar and the invitation of the elves to Valar. I'm not going to tell that whole story. I'm totally not, right? Yeah. Okay, fine. We've overcome that temptation. The Eldar were those who set out and marched to the western shores of the Old World. Most of them then passed over the sea and came to that land in the ancient west, which they called Valinor, a name that means the land of the powers or the rulers of the world. Oh, darn! I mentioned the powers again. Right there, I go. It's okay. We know that the powers exist. They come up in the Lord of the Rings, so I guess we can allude to them there, as long as we don't actually get into the whole story of their invitation to the elves and stuff like that. It's fine. It's fine. Okay. But some of the Eldar, hang on, I'll read the first data point first. But some of the Eldar remained behind in the northwest of Middle-earth, and these were called the Lendi, or lingerers. And then he added, but some of the Eldar of the kindred of the Teleri remained behind in the northwest. I'm afraid this is retrograde movement, Tolkien, right? You were doing fine. You had compressed the subdivisions of the Eldar into 2. The Eldar and the... That's what matters. What really matters is that you've got the Eldar on the one hand, you've got the Avari on the other hand. That's what really matters. Except now he's opening the can, right? The Eldar are subdivided into 3 other kindreds, right? One of which is the Teleri. He's leaking again, right? This time he's leaking in the revision. He's adding that in. It's okay. It's okay, man. I hear you, Tolkien. It's fine. It's fine. Okay. So some of them remain behind in the northwest of Middle-earth. It is with Eldarin tongues, Valinorian or Lemberin, changed to Telerian, that these tales are concerned. Okay. So we've gotten as far as 2 languages. So the elves originally were one people and had one language. They were the Quendi, and they had one language. Then they split up into the Avari and the Eldar. And the Avari traveled across the old world and crossed the sea, at which point they still spoke the same language as the Avari. Right? One language, one people. Still one language. Still one language. Crossing the sea. One language. Snapshot. That's where we are. Okay. 2 languages. And then, yes, Eric, you're right in saying it is with Eldarin tongues. That is, so what is going to be, because of course we did the second split. So you had the Eldar, and then the Eldar split into the Eldar who stayed behind and the Eldar who went to Valinor. So what happened to the language of the Avari? We don't care. We don't care. Pay no attention to the Avari out in the east. Now we have 2 languages. Still the same original language, right? At first. Some of them stayed behind, some of them went across the sea. When that happened, they spoke the same language. So now we have the Valinorian language and the Lemberin language. The elves of those who went across and the elves of those who stay behind. Okay, fine. In Valinor, from the language of that Elvish kindred known as the Lindar, which will be changed to the Vanyar, but it isn't yet. They're not the Vanyar. They're not the Vanyar yet. That's a post change. That's a post 1950 change. But the people that we think of from the 1977 Silmarillion as the Vanyar, one of the three peoples. Did I mention that the Eldar divided into three? I didn't exactly, but roll with it, people. Roll with it. In Valinor, from the language of that portion of the Eldar known as the Lindar, was made a High Elven speech that, after the elves had devised letters, was used not only for lore and formal writing, but also for high converse and for intercourse among elves of different kinds. This, which is indeed an Elven Latin, as it were, unchanging in time and place, the elves themselves called Quenya. That is simply Elvish. Okay, so in Valinor, the Eldar, develop Quenya. Great. Eric, I think the Lindar are being named after music, but I'm not really sure if Linde meant that yet in 1949 or whenever this is. This is exactly the kind of thing that I don't know, because I haven't studied the Quenya enough to know. Okay. Anyway, right. So we have Quenya. And by the way, it's called Quenya. Isn't that refreshing? Remember from last time, none of the three languages were called what we thought they would be called, right? But now it's called Quenya. Great. Okay, so the elves in Valinor, Valinorian language is Quenya. Excellent. And notice it's called Quenya because it is called Elvish. Like that's what Quenya means. It just means Elvish. So the concept here is that Quenya is like original Elvish or like pure Elvish in some sense. It is Elven Latin in the sense that it is unchanging in time and place. It becomes a language of lore. It's not the language that they develop and use. So we already have the idea that even in Valinor, potentially, there is shifting language among the elves there. There are different peoples, apparently, though he hasn't fully explained that, but there are different peoples among the Eldar, and their languages are kind of growing apart from each other, potentially. But they keep Quenya as a lingua franca still in Valinor. Nobody's come back yet, right? And yet we already have the need of an Elven Latin for intercourse among elves of different kinds. So the Elven languages are changing in Valinor, but we've preserved a language which we're calling Elvish because it's the overall Elvish classic language. That's it. Elvish classic. That's exactly it. Okay, so that's our concept. That's the concept of what it means, what Quenya is. Old Elvish. Original Elvish. Kept deliberately as a, not a fossil, that's unkind, as a display piece, as an exhibit, as a monument to their history, right? Preserved to be a language of lore. And therefore, because it's a language of lore and not of daily use, it's not subject to the shifts that come through daily use. So it's preserved. It's a museum piece, Quenya, a Valinorian museum piece. Tenacious Star, this is a marvelous question, which we've kind of seen in various places, Tolkien kind of exploring, and he'll get to some of that here tonight. But it's a fine question. How does a language change when its speakers never die? Wouldn't that make it easier to preserve? Yes, you'd think, right? I mean, we all know people who still speak their native accent even when they haven't lived in their native country. Like people who come over here to America, like Brits who come over to America and are still speaking with their same British accent, 50 years later, right? Like we've all known people like that, right? And we also know people whose accents change over time, depending on where they live, Eric, as you say. But one explanation of this dynamic, however, of the change of Elvish languages is that Tolkien emphasizes, especially in his, like back in the Llamas and the earlier materials, he emphasized that the elves love to change their language. They love to experiment. To the elves, the development of their language was a creative project. They loved to develop and play with and experiment with, and like again, it was a mode of creative expression to develop their language. So it isn't that it drifted; it merely drifted over time. So that is, I think, the biggest and like primary example of Tenacious Star as to why the Elvish languages would not only change, but sometimes change swiftly. Exactly, Tenacious Star. So elves are philologists, as JJ says. So the entire elf race is an author self-insert. Yeah, kinda. They do seem suspiciously fond of philology, the elves. Yeah. Not exactly. It's not, I mean, that is obviously a jokingly reductive way to say it, but it's also not wholly untrue either. Anyway, okay. All right. So we've established what Quenya is, and I'm belaboring this so much because I'm trying to override any knee-jerk. I'm trying to, in myself as well, by the way, this is self-talk at the same time. I am trying to talk down my own 1977 Silmarillion context that I bring to this text, right? I know what Quenya is. I know where Quenya comes from. Of course I do. I've read the Silmarillion, same as you have, right? So I am being especially blatant in drawing attention to what Tolkien is actually saying here in order to differentiate it in our heads between what we think we know from the 1977 Silmarillion. Okay. Now, after long ages of peace, it came to pass, as is related in the Quenta Noldorian, that the Noldor, who were of all the kindreds of the Eldar. Did I mention there are multiple kindreds of the Eldar? I kind of didn't explain it, but you're kind of picking it up now, aren't you? That the Noldor, who were of all the kindreds of the Eldar the most skilled in crafts and lore, departed as exiles from Valinor and returned to Middle-earth, seeking the great jewels, the Silmarilli, which Feanor, chief of all their craftsmen, had made. Okay, now you have to admit, that is a concise sentence. Right? That's pretty boss right there, right? If he'd skipped the Silmarilli and the great jewels, he could have made it even more concise. If he had stopped at departed as exiles from Valinor and returned to Middle-earth, that would have been amazingly concise, right? But he throws the Silmarils in there and Feanor, which, fine, Feanor gets mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, right? So we might as well throw that in there. But I do agree, Eric, props for mentioning that they were seeking the Silmarilli without explaining exactly what makes them so great. Why were they seeking them? How did that happen? How did they come to lose them, right? Enormous restraint being exercised in that sentence. It's deeply impressive. Their language, Noldorin, that at first differed little from the Lindarin or Quenya, became on their return to Middle-earth subject to the change which even things devised by elves here suffer. And in the passing of time it grew wholly unlike to the Quenya of Valinor, which tongue the exiles nonetheless retained always in memory as a language of lore and song and courtesy. Okay, so we're following this, right? We're following this. So their language is Noldorin. So remember, as was hinted, in Valinor there was language drift happening. The different kindreds were developing different languages. From the original language they had when they got on the boat, now the Lindar have their own language, Lindarin. And the Noldor have their own language, Noldorin. And neither of them speaks Quenya. But they all retain Quenya, right? It's been enshrined as Elf Latin, right? So they know it, and they use it as a language of lore and song and courtesy. So the Noldor bring two languages back with them to Middle-earth. Noldorin, what they speak, and Quenya, what they use but don't speak every day. Yes, and Eric, I agree. It is fascinating, isn't it? It's fascinating because they changed their dialect, not from ignorance of the original dialect, but with full knowledge of both. Yeah. Exactly. Okay, but wait, there's a footnote. Tolkien's footnote. On the other hand, the Noldorin and Lemberin tongues. Oh wait, who are the Lemberin tongue, remember, is the language spoken by the people left over. So presumably, the Lemberin tongue and Lemberin and Lindarin and Noldorin all come from the same root, the original elf language that was originally spoken, which everybody spoke on the day that most of the Eldar got on the boat. Everybody spoke that language. Then the Lemberin language begins to change and become Lemberin and Noldorin and Lindarin, and Quenya gets preserved. So now we've got our three languages. Lemberin, back home in Middle-earth, in the old world. Noldorin, the new language of the Noldor, the new and improved language of the Noldor. And Quenya, scholarly Elf Latin, the language of lore and song and courtesy. Right? Okay, so we're tracking. We're tracking what the three languages are and where they've come from. And Spiritual Blizzard, again, this is why I keep doing this, because it is an incredible difference from the 1977 Silmarillion. Like, this is so different from the story we think we know, right? And it's so easy to slip back into that story that, again, that's why I'm being so labored here, because it's hard even for me to keep this straight from what we think we know. No, Eric, it's the other way around. Lemberin is changed to Tellerin. Lindarin is changed to Vanyarin. Yes. Yeah, the Lindar are the Vanyar, the Lembi are the Teleri. Yeah, that's what you meant. Okay, yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, all right. Anyway, sorry, footnote. On the other hand, the Noldorin and Lemberin tongues that had long been sundered, being now spoken by peoples dwelling side by side. So the Noldor have come back. So now in Middle-earth, you've got Noldor and you've got Limbi. So now you've got all three languages mixing in Middle-earth, mixing it up in various more or less constructive ways, right, in Middle-earth. So they had long been sundered, being now spoken by peoples dwelling side by side. So they drew closer together. So now they're influencing each other. Now Lemberin and Noldorin start to influence each other and become more similar. And though they remained wholly distinct, became similar in sound and style. Yeah. Jackie says, how does anyone keep this straight? And Fanharos Pizza says, I just remind myself it's going to change again soon. Yes. It's true. It's not imperative that we know, but the exercise that I'm wanting to perform, because again, I have, as I said at the beginning in my long prologue, my long preamble here today, I find it so exciting to think about this. I'm trying to inject myself back to 1949 to try to understand as best I can what, if you had asked Tolkien, write the sketch of the mythology for me right now in 1949. Had he sat down to write the sketch of the mythology, which of course he's kind of doing here, right? What would it be? What would the story have been at this time? All right. But we're all tracking. Everyone's following. Now, let's talk about the tongues of men, because the Elvish languages aren't confusing enough. According to the elves, men shared, though in a lesser degree, many of the powers of the elves, and they were capable of devising languages of a sort for themselves, as indeed they have done, it seems, in many remote lands. So, out in the remote eastern lands where they didn't have Eldar to hang out with, humans managed to develop language. Notice, by the way, he doesn't say here that the Avari helped them. That's in the 77 Silmarillion. Doesn't say that here. So here we are imagining only human language. Languages that humans made with no influence from outside. And yes, I agree, Eric. Languages of a sort is fairly savage. I mean, like, that's harsh. That's harsh. He's not speaking glowingly of apparently the powers of the ancient humans compared to the powers of the ancient elves is of a significantly lesser degree, right? Yeah, they can make language. It's not very good though, right? Their language is he doesn't use the word crude, but I think that's what he's talking about here. Yes, Eric, it is very like the use of the word barbarian to describe the Greek use of barbarian and the Latin the Roman adoption of the concept of the barbarians, who speak all those uncivilized languages which barely count as languages, or whatever. Yeah. Anyway, so yes. Okay. So no elf interference, humans making these. I'm going to go with, instead of saying crude, because again, Tolkien doesn't say that, I want to put words in his mouth, I will say barbaric, Eric, because that seems to be precisely the kind of thing that he's describing, the way that the Greeks and Romans thought of, like, German, for instance, as a barbaric language. Okay. But in fact, men did not in all regions go through the slow and painful process of invention. In the north and west of the Old World, that is, where the Eldar lived, they learned language directly and fully made from elves, who befriended them in their infancy and early wanderings. So this is, I think, the beginning of where the Avari thing comes in. Hang on, let me just read this whole sentence and not stop. But in fact, men did not in all regions go through the slow and painful process of invention. In the north and west of the Old World, they learned language directly and fully made from elves, who befriended them in their infancy and early wanderings. And the tongues of men, which are, however remotely, of this origin, the Quendi have at all times found the more pleasant to their own ears. Now stop for a second. Tell me the necessary background of history for understanding this linguistic development. That is to say, what is the story? Tell me the story of the origins of humans based on this. Forget 1977. Forget the published Silmarillion. Based on this, what is the history of men? The origin story of men. Many humans were taught to speak. Which ones? A subdivision of them. Are we talking about the Edain? We're not talking about the Edain yet. The Edain is the next paragraph. The picture we're being given. Men did not in all regions go through the slow and painful process of invention? Sorry, let me say that with a different emphasis. But in fact, men did not in all regions go through the slow and painful process of invention. In many regions, they did. Because, they were capable of devising languages of a sort. Right? Barbaric languages for themselves. So, men, the origin of men is widespread. It's all over the place. It's all over the place, such that encounters even with the Avari. Yeah, no, we're not. We're 2 steps shy of Numenor yet. We're 2 steps shy of Numenor. We're being invited to imagine men all over the place. All over the place. Where are their elves? Only in the Northwest. It's not just, I made a mistake right there. In my, when I was pausing in the middle to do commentary, I made a mistake and it's like, oh, we're talking about the Eldar, North and West, Beleriand. But no, he's not talking about the Edain yet. He's not talking about the Eldar. He's talking about the Avari. When in the history of the development of the Elvish languages did the men encounter elves of unspecified people group, elf group? When did they encounter the elves? When in the Elvish history did they encounter them? As far as we can see, when they were still speaking one language. He doesn't say. Notice he makes no comment about the idea that they learned language from the Avari, which was very different. So that when humans whose language was in origin the language taught to them by these Avari elves, because the language of the Avari will have changed from the language of the Eldar, right? So when they finally get to them, their language is going to sound super weird because it's going to be Avari language based. He doesn't say that. Yeah, Eric, one of the questions that I'm asking here too is, so hang on 1949 Tolkien, where's Cuiviénen again? Exactly? It sounds like elves, not just Eldar, but elves are concentrated in the Northwest, whereas men are everywhere. And this doesn't necessarily mean that that humans already massively outnumber the elves necessarily, though they may. But in geographic spread, we're talking about the infancy of men. He uses that word, infancy and early wanderings. But remember, he started off saying many of the humans invented devised a language of a sort for themselves. But a subset of them, their early wanderings brought them into contact with the elves in the north and west of the Old World. And those learned Elvish languages, and their languages are derived from the Elvish language that they were taught. So all of those barbaric language-speaking languages of a sort, speaking men, were wandering over the apparently something like 3/4 of the continent that had no elves in them. Isn't that interesting? This just does not sound like the picture. This doesn't sound much like the 1977 picture of the origin of elves or the origin of men. Now, he's not told the story of the origin of men or of elves, exactly. Cuiviénen has not been mentioned here, right? I'm asking because, readers of the 1977 Silmarillion want to know, right, where Cuiviénen is. But the whole feel of this is quite different. Men might be the second born. They might be the aftercomers. But they're not, they sound like in at least geographic spread, if not in population, they are already the majority. The elves are already localized, right? We're long before the beginning of the fading time, and yet the elves are already a parochial people compared to men. And that's Crazy, right? That's very different. Okay. No blame to the elves. Quendi, meaning all elves, right? Who prefer the sound of the languages that are derived from Elvish languages than those languages of a sort that they derive, those barbaric languages they derive for themselves. Yet soon, even these Western tongues of men became estranged from the speech of elves, being changed by process of time, or by men's own inventions and additions, or by other influences, notably that of the dwarves, from whom long ago some men learned much, especially of delving, building, and smithying. So the final picture we get at the end of this paragraph is that, so you've got human language all over the place. Some of it not very good, to be perfectly frank, right? But some of them, but even those who learn it from the elves, it changes. And so we presumably have many human dialects, just different from each other. And you can't say, I don't want you to think that the humans are just speaking Elvish, because they're totally not. Even when their language is derived from the elves, they're still speaking their own unique Mannish languages because they changed and developed over time. Okay, fine. Now the men who first came westward out of the heart of Middle-earth to lands near the shores of the sea were called by the elves Atani, added, or in the Noldorin, the Edain, the fathers of men, and there was great friendship between the two races. So notice, that's not who we were referring to. Of the men in the north and west of the old world, that's not the Edain, that's not the Eldar, all elves, right? The men who came to the shores of the sea, that's Beleriand, that's the Edain. So that's a further subset. So we now have 3 subsets of humans. You've got the biggest portion of all humans, which are barbaric sort of language speakers, right? Wandering about 3/4 of the continent. And then you've got humans whose languages are derived from Elvish languages, probably Avari or whatever, who are wandering around 25% of the continent. And then you've got now the subset of them who go all the way to the shore and get involved with the Eldar. And those are the Atani, or called in Noldorin, because it's absolutely not called Sindarin, the Edain. Okay. And there was great friendship. For when the fathers of men came over the mountains, they met for the first time the Eldar, or High Elves. And the Eldar were at that time engaged in a ceaseless war with the Dark Lord of that age, one greater far than Sauron, who was but one of his minions. In that war, 3 houses of the fathers of men aided the elves, especially the Noldor, and lived among them and fought beside them. And the people, changed to lords of those houses, learned the Noldorin speech, struck out, and forsook their own tongue. Yeah, he's leaking again. I agree. By the way, the far greater than Sauron, who is but one of his minions, was a great save by Tolkien there. He really pulled it in, didn't he? He's about to describe like the War of the Jewels and, like the main plot line of the First Age. But he less than a sentence. And he pulls it in by being like, why am I talking about the Dark Lord of that age? Like, who's like a completely different story and don't even really have time to tell you who he is. Notice he doesn't even connect it to the theft of the Silmarils. He's talked about the Silmarilli, right? And the recovery of the great jewels. He talks about the recovery of the great jewels in one paragraph, and he talks about the Dark Lord of that age in another paragraph, but he doesn't even draw a connection between. He just leaves it, right? Pretty good. He's doing a great job of being very concise and disciplined here. And again, the reference to Sauron, right? It's like, because you've read The Lord of the Rings. This is an appendix. You've read The Lord of the Rings. So you should, just for context, just to help you imagine, right? The Dark Lord Sauron, the antagonist of this whole book, he was just a minion of this dude, right? And he's not even going to name him. Okay. Tenacious Stars, feeling pain on Tolkien's behalf. Just let the guy write the Silmarillion. I know, here I'm praising him for not writing the Silmarillion, right? But no, that is not the project he is undertaking here. Okay. In that war, but let's look at those the line between those data points again, the cross-outs and substitutions here. Do you see the two data points? It's kind of three, but it's kind of two. First draft. And the people of these houses learned the Noldorin speech and forsook their own tongue. Okay, so the Edain, these three peoples, right? These three houses of the fathers of men, stopped speaking their human language entirely, and just speak Noldorin now. And I agree, Jackie, forsook their own tongue is a big deal. Christopher does like a whole rant on this, right, in his notes. Christopher's like, this is amazing that he wrote that. But he did write that. But then he strikes it out. So this other data point is he strikes out and forsook their own tongues. So they're learning the Noldorin speech, but now if you cross out the last bit, it now sounds like it's as a second language, right? In addition to their language. And also, he changes it from people to lords. It's not that all of the Edain learn the Noldorin speech and forsake their own tongue. It's just that the lords of those houses do. So it's like an ambassadorial thing, right? If you're having a political interchange with the Noldor, you've got to speak. You've got to speak it, right? You've got to speak Noldorin. But, the average Edain on the street doesn't need to speak Noldorin, and certainly doesn't need to forsake their own language entirely. Yeah, it is like how the Franks and later the Normans forsook their Germanic tongues and adopted Latin/French, Eric, and also like Saxon nobles having to learn Norman after the invasion. Yeah, it's a little bit like, but it's not you've been conquered. It's you've joined up, right? But the uneven power dynamic is similar. Golly, Eric, it strikes me that Tolkien would not thank me for that parallel. I don't think Tolkien would be entirely chuffed by my saying that the relationship between the Edain, the linguistic relationship between the Edain and the Noldor, was parallel to the Saxons and the Normans. I think I'd have to duck if I said that to Tolkien's face. But there's although the circumstances are different, there's a certain similarity there. Yeah, I agree, Eric. More like Saxon nobles pre-invasion learning Frankish and dealing with Charlemagne. Yeah, exactly. It is a remarkable token of allegiance, Jackie, and more than a token of allegiance. Again, the first draft especially suggests it's a complete immersion, right? A cultural immersion. Their whole way of life becomes to some degree subsumed in the culture of the Eldar, completely subsumed in the first draft, incompletely subsumed in the second draft. And yes, I agree that suggests that great friendship between them is an understatement. Yeah. Now, in his notes on this paragraph, we get a delightful moment, which of course I can't pass over, and I'll end with this tonight. And that is a quote from Faramir. We alluded before to that letter that Tolkien wrote where he said that he's met this Gondorian captain in Ithilien, but if he doesn't stop talking soon, he's going to be relegated to the Appendices. We've alluded to that letter a couple times. Here is an example of one of the things that Faramir, captain of Gondor, rambled on and on about, and not only got relegated to the Appendices, but got relegated to an endnote on an account of an early draft of the Appendices, in fact, right? So here it is. Faramir is saying, "Some there are of Gondor who have dealings with the elves. One great advantage we have. We speak an elvish speech, or one so near akin that we can in part understand them, and they us." Remember, in the published Lord of the Rings, it just sounds like they're speaking Sindarin. It sounds like they're speaking Elvish. But here, in this explanation, which gets cut from the text, Faramir is explaining that their language, they speak a language that is so near akin to Elvish that we can in part understand them and they us. You know, like Norwegian and Swedish. You know, if you speak Norwegian to a Swede who doesn't know any Norwegian, they'll be able to follow most of what you say. They're not the same language, but they're near akin. So you can impart, that seems to be the kind of situation that he's describing, right? And so Faramir claims that when, like Mablung and Damrod in The Lord of the Rings, are speaking in an Elvish tongue to each other, they're not speaking Elvish. They're not speaking Sindarin or Noldorin. They're speaking their language, but their language was totally subsumed for so long that it only differs from Elvish as much as, like, for instance, Norwegian and Swedish. At this, Sam exclaimed, "But you speak the ordinary language, same as us, though a bit old-fashioned like, if you'll pardon my saying it." Then Faramir replied, "Of course we do, for that is our own tongue, which we perhaps preserve better than you do far in the north. The common tongue, as some call it, is derived from the Númenóreans, being but a form changed by time of that speech which the fathers of the three houses," struck out Hador and Haleth and Beor, maybe we don't need the actual names in the text of The Lord of the Rings, "spoke of old. This language it is that has spread through the Western world amongst all folk and creatures that use words, to some only a second tongue for use in intercourse with strangers, to some the only tongue they know, like hobbits. But this is not an Elvish speech in my meaning. All speech of men in this world is Elvish in descent, but only if one go back to the beginnings. What I meant was, so apparently those barbaric semi-languages pretty well died out, I guess. At least Faramir thinks so. But then again, he's not been everywhere in the, to the other whole rest of the 3/4 of the continent now, has he? But anyway, okay. What I meant was so. The lords changed to many men of the three houses long ago gave up man speech and spoke the tongue of their friends, the Noldor or gnomes. A high Elvish tongue struck out akin to, but changed from the ancient Elvish of Elvenhome, and always the lords of Númenor knew that tongue and used it among themselves. And so still do we among ourselves." First of all, can you imagine this paragraph in The Lord of the Rings? Oh my goodness. This is so bewildering. Like, even as carefully as we've been trying to construct it, it's hard to follow, right? It's amazing. It's amazing. But you can see the history like he was describing there in paragraph 7, you can see his allusion to it, right? So Faramir gives a sort of a longer version of this history. Okay, so, but Faramir doesn't tell the story in order. So let's try to unpack that a little bit, and then we'll go. Then I'll be done for tonight. All speech of men in this world, according to Faramir, is Elvish in descent, if one go back to the beginnings. So here he's talking about human language evolving from what they learned from the elves in the beginning. Fine. But then Many men of the three houses long ago gave up man's speech and spoke the tongue and spoke Noldorin, as we just learned in paragraph 7. Okay. So, and they've hung on to that. But what Sam calls ordinary language, and which Faramir calls the common tongue, he says is derived from the Númenóreans. And the Númenórean language, he says, derives from, is a form, but a form changed by time of the speech of the fathers of the three houses. So, they had their original language, and then they learned Noldorin. And he's saying that the Númenóreans kept alive the original language, the original Mannish language of the Edain. And that was the Númenórean language, and that's where the common speech comes from. That's what Faramir is saying here. But like the Edain of old, who spoke their man speech and didn't actually totally replace it, but also learned Noldorin, same with the Gondorians. But the speech that they're speaking it's shifted from like pure Elvish. Because this is now like, sorry, Eric, I'm now thinking about Middle English and stuff since I mentioned the Norman invasion. I'm thinking about like the difference between Anglo-Norman and Old French. Once Norman French had been spoken in England for a long time, people were still using French. Like French was the official language of the English court for hundreds of years after the invasion. But Anglo-Norman, that is the French that they spoke in England now, was changing in different ways from Old French, right? And from the way that Old French was developing within France. So we're working our way towards modern French. We're working our way towards modern English. The two French dialects had begun to differ. But I believe that, somebody who, like a nobleman who had been raised in the English court in 1300, say, or 1250 or something like that, when they went to France, the French that they spoke wouldn't be exactly the same as the French they were speaking in Paris at that time, but they would be speaking a French that was so near akin that they could in part understand them and they us, basically, is I think what the kind of linguistic situation that he's describing. Or a Quebecois today going to Paris. Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Hey, there you even have like crossing the sea from the old world, right? And language changing. And so I think we can therefore conclude our discussion today with the obvious conclusion that Quebec is in fact Valinor. So there we are. And I think my impression is that the citizens of Montreal would entirely agree with that sentiment and would wholeheartedly endorse that speech. But yeah, Jackie says it reminds her of her two different high school French instructors. Yeah, I learned French in high school in New Hampshire, which is always kind of interesting because, of course, we're sort of learning Parisian French. We were sort of learning Parisian French, but at the same time, we're right next to Quebec, right? We border Quebec. Like the practical usage of French was, French Canadian, rather than, we New Hampshire high school students were far more likely to encounter France in Quebec than we were likely to encounter it in Paris. So there was a little bit of a sort of a conflict in my own instruction there. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, let us pause there and we shall resume. Next time, tune in next time to learn more about, turn in next time when I ask, wait, what language do the Númenóreans speak again? We'll get there. We'll get there next time. Thank you so much, everybody. This stuff is really hard to untangle. Not because it's intrinsically complicated, but because it's so different from what we think we know. But I want to continue attempting to do this. So thanks, everybody, for bearing with me in this rather painstaking and sometimes painful exercise. But I think it really pays off. It puts the Lord of the Rings in a totally different context when instead of just juxtaposing the 77 Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings together, we actually begin to get an insight into the Silmarillion that was in Tolkien's head when he was writing the Silmarillion. And it's a wild and crazy kind of world to live in. Thanks, everybody. I will talk to you guys. I should be around next week. Is that true? I think that's true. Sorry, I'm hesitating. That might not be true. Actually, sorry, wait. That's totally not true, in fact. I'm going to be away next Wednesday. But I might be back the Wednesday following. That, I suspect, is true. Okay, so I will not be here next week, but I will be here the following week. So the next week, which is going to be the 30th of July, I'll be away. But I will be back in the first, the 6th or 7th of August or whenever that is. But I'm pretty sure that's true. I'm pretty sure that's true. We're going to be, my son Matthias has been away this summer on a summer program, a pre-college program. And my wife and I are driving out to pick him up, and then on the way home, or take a roundabout way home, doing some college visits on the way home. So exactly what time of what day we're leaving and time of what day we're returning is not my call. So I'm not the planner of this. I'm when there are family trips, I am never the planner. So that's why I speak with less than 100% confidence about where I'm going to be and when. But I believe that on the 6th I will be back in time, and if not, surely on the 13th. But anyway, we'll come back again soon, and we will re-wrap our brains around this material. Thanks very much, everybody. See you guys soon. Bye now.